Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and is going to be on Tribal Grants Management Part 4, presented by Vince Franco. I will be your webinar facilitator today. My name is Alyssa Atkins, and I am the Training and Development Coordinator for the Native Learning Center. Just a quick disclaimer, this webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. The materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws and treaties. The terms permit you to use the sites for your personal, non-commercial use only. You may print or save copies of the sites solely for your personal, non-commercial use. You may not distribute, transfer, transmit copy, upload, download, post, publish, display, perform, modify, or otherwise create derivative works from any of the materials without the Seminole Tribe's prior written consent. Alrighty, now the fun stuff. If you look at the top of your screen, you will see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. With that icon, you can either raise hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you will see a box that says Files. Here you will find today's presentation. Please feel free to download a copy for yourself. Simply click the item you would like to download, then click the arrow pointing downwards to download and save onto your device. Once the item is downloaded, it should appear in your device's download section. The second box labeled Web Links is where you will find our survey about today's webinar, along with any other links that will be seen throughout today's presentation. Finally, to the right of the screen, we have a chat box available. This is how you will communicate with instructor and NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to interact by using the chat box. Simply type your message and hit enter or click that up arrow icon button to submit. We do encourage class participation, so please feel free to write in those questions or comments. Tech support issues should also be submitted here. Know that most can be solved by exiting and re-entering the meeting room. Please feel free to email me as well if you have any tech issues. Let's all try out the chat box together now by typing in your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Vince. Welcome, Vince.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, welcome everyone. I see there are some questions already coming up in the chat box. I'm going to try to keep an eye on that. I know NLC staff will do the same. Hey, everyone, welcome. This is a very, very, very special day on many levels, let alone what we're going to be talking about in a few minutes about what you see on the screen, the grants management under NAHASDA Part 4, getting into the uniform guidance regulations. I'll get into that in just a minute, but today is also kind of a special day because I don't know what's going to happen. This is the last working day of the week, last working day of the month, of the quarter, of the fiscal year, the government fiscal year. And speaking of the fiscal year, the government year, I was just looking on the news to see if Kevin McCarthy and his group of Republicans and all of the Senate and all the legislators have figured out if they're going to shut down the government in a couple hours or if it's going to stay open. If anyone has more news on up-to-date news, let me know. But to me, it sure looks like, unfortunately, they're going to shut down, which all kinds of things. I don't know if any of you have gone through that before. I have. About not even 10 years ago, they did shut down the government. All federal employees, just stopped working. That would include all the HUD and ONAP offices, and let alone the ones that they talk about all the times on the news, the Border Patrol and TSA and all that. So it's a very unusual day, very unusual time we're in right now. So I'm like everyone else. I'm wondering what's happening. So anyway, let's move on and talk about what we're going to do about here, and that is the last session, Part 4 of Grants Management under NAHASDA. understanding, in my opinion, as a past compliance officer, probably one of the most important aspects of any type of organization that receives federal funding, and that is a good understanding, a foundation of understanding, learning how to navigate and interpret the federal regulations. Now, if you were with me last week, we talked about the regulations, or more like guidances. They're not regulations, guidances that HUD developed for recipients of the Indian Housing Block Grant through the development of the 24 CFR Part 1000, which is Native American housing activities. It's written in a narrative style, question and answer. It's easy to follow. They did a good job with it, I think. And there's been some updates to it over the years. And then the week before that, we talked about the legislation. We talked about NAHASDA. Today, we're really going to drill down and talk about the regulations, the uniform guidance, the super circulated, 2 CFR Part 200, which, if you receive the Indian Housing Block Grant, which I assume most of you do, or any kind of federal funding, just about all of the federal funds through all the agencies use the uniform guidance that's put out by OMB, Office of Management and Budget, for the regulations. Every 5 years, they come out with new versions. And guess what happened last week? Under the not the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, they have rolled out brand new proposed regulations or changes to the regulations, to the uniform guidance. So you're in a really good place at a really good time, because on the 23rd of September, just last week, what's today, the 29th, 6 days ago, the White House put out, and you can go to whitehouse.gov and you can see for yourself. You would want to go to the site and Google or type in proposed updates to the uniform guidance, and you'll see it just like I did. Now, I've taken the past 5 days, 6 days to go through that document and try to understand what they're trying to do. So this is probably one of the webinars that you want to have pen and paper handy, because what I'm going to do, you'll see momentarily when I start getting into it, is I'm going to work my way through the regulations, the 6 subparts of the regulations, A, B, C, D, E, and F, and I'm going to go through it. I'm going to pull out what already was in the presentation on highlights to those 6 sections. And since it's so new, I don't have it built into the presentation, but as we go through, I'm going to give you the proposed updates throughout the document, pertaining to the specific regulation. So I'll give you what's existing, and I'll also talk about what is proposed. And there are a lot of them, and some of them are significant. So keep pen and paper handy, because by the time we're done with this 90 plus or minus minutes from now, you're going to be the go-to person for interpretation. So I have that to present to you. And then at the very tail end, if we have time, what they also added in there are some projections of even farther out. In other words, changes to the uniform guide, not just proposed that we're going to be talking about, but those about 7 of them, 6 or 7 of them that are on the radar screen, that are in development, which we may see in a year from now, year and a half. So you're going to get the leg up on what's happening with these federal regulations and be prepared. So I want to, as we go through, make a distinction of what's in place, what you have to abide by as a federal regulation, and then what is proposed. Now, the way it reads, it says that it was proposed and rolled out last week on the 21st of September, just last week. The effective date has not been determined yet by OMB, because they've got to go out after publication. So after September 21st, you got to add 60 days to that for opinions and evaluations and all that stuff to come back to OMB before they come out with the revised version of the proposed updates. So my educated guess is that a lot of this stuff will probably be even more fine-tuned. Some of it is a little open-ended, when we go through, you'll see, you know, there's things like we're going to enhance this or improve that. So some of it is open-ended, but that should be finalized. What is it? The end of September, October, November, by some, maybe at the front end, maybe as early as December of this year, we would have up, you know, we'd have the real thing, the final rule, and then most, you know, to put into effect. But here, at least, you know, you can have an idea of how to plan going forward with these regulations. If this is new to you, God bless you, then you know, then you're not going to, this is all new. But if you're, you know, like some of us that have been doing this for a number of years, some of these changes are amazing. So let's get into it. I'll share with you, because I got the document right here in front of me, and I'm going to try to parallel as we go through, talk about the regulations as it exists now, and then give you the new interpretation of what possibly could be happening. So let's get right to it. We're at the bottom end there, part 4, understanding ONB, uniform guidance regulations, aka super circular. First half of the presentation will be on subparts A, B, and C, which typically pertain to federal agencies and not so much the recipients of funding. The second half of the present, and I'll try to move through that quickly because a lot of it is dealing with agencies and how they administer federal funding and not so much us. But there are some things in there that we need to be aware of. And then the second half of the presentation, D, E, and F, gets into cost principles and audits and all those things that we have to deal with. So I'll slow the pace down a little bit and I'll present information there. I'll also try to keep an eye on the chat box. I know Awista will. If you have any questions or concerns, put them in there. Oh, and by the way, bottom of your screen on the left, under files, it says 1E, proposed updates to the uniform guidance. Download that, mark it up, use it. That's what I'm looking at. That's the document that I put together based on what came out of the White House, whitehouse.gov on the updates. So you'll have what I have. So let's hold on and move forward on this, get right into it. The compliance pyramid, nothing unusual here. Kind of talked about this already. At the top of the pyramid are the legislation, the act, that's the NAHASDA. And then the middle section, kind of what we've been talking of, zeroing here are the regulations. Last week, 24 CFR 1000, that's HUD's regulations guidelines. And then today, drilling down on the 2 CFR Part 200. And where we always talk about program guidance, agency directives, internal controls, policies, and procedures, best practices, which are the base of the pyramid. Well, let's keep going. Okay. Subparts A, B, and C. Acquisition cost is in subpart A is all about acronyms and definitions. So let me go through here. I'll move through it very, very quickly because most of this stuff is pretty straightforward. Nothing unusual here with acquisition costs. That remains the same. Auditor remains the same. Budget pyramid, period remains the same. Capital assets and computing devices. Now, here's where we have our first set of changes. Let's look at this real quick. Capital assets, tangible, intangible assets used by the non-federal entity, NFE, that's us, federal funding recipients, having a useful life of more than a year, which capitalize in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, includes land, buildings, equipment, intellectual property like software, that type of thing. And they've recently, not just recently, but a couple of years ago, also added in smartphones and computing devices. So means machines used to acquire, store, analyze, process, publish data. That's today's smartphones. They can do just about anything, right? Computing devices is a supply if the acquisition cost is less than $5,000, regardless of its useful life. So we tell you here, right here, that number 5,000 is changed. It is proposed to change. What we're talking. Hold on a second. Okay. One of the proposed changes in this area with anything to do. Now they're treating computing devices as more or less as a supply. So we've got equipment and we've got supplies. Both of those thresholds, kind of the magic number is $5,000, below that or above that. They are proposing to raise that to $10,000. All right, that's one of the items that's included in the proposal. Okay. So I want you to be aware of that. And here it goes on to a definition of supplies, means all tangible property other than those described in the definition of equipment with a value below 5,000. Again, they're talking here specifically about supplies, and below at the bottom of your screen, they're talking about equipment. And there's different types of equipment. There's general equipment, then there's specialty equipment. Regardless of that, in both categories, supplies and equipment, they're again, let me use the word proposed. They're proposing to increase that from $5,000 to $10,000. So I think that works very, very, I hope that comes through. You can thank the Biden administration for that, but I hope that comes through, and that gives us a lot more flexibility in the way that we look at equipment and supplies. Because, if you're like the Native Learning Center, probably 95% of the purchases of the procurement are supply driven, not so much equipment. There's very little equipment that's purchased, but now they're talking about raising that threshold in both categories, supplies and equipment. So that's the first two major changes there. So I want you to be aware of that. Changes in the thresholds. These thresholds, by the way, revising, that's one of the themes throughout the update. If you take a close look at it like I did, that's the first two potential threshold increases. But wherever there's a threshold throughout the regulations, there's going to be a couple more that we'll talk about. They're proposing to increase them, including the audit thresholds, which I'll get into in a few minutes. All right. Here's a little bit more information, the difference between general purpose equipment and specialty equipment. Specialty equipment is usually reserved for medical activities, microscopes, x-rays, machines, which makes up maybe 5% of procurement for equipment, generally speaking. The bulk of our procurement in equipment is general, but still we have that new potential threshold going up. So 5,000 used to be our magic number. Now we might have 10,000. So write that one down. There's one of the potential increases. All right, then there's a definition of information technology system, which is also considered equipment. Now that falls into the category along with it, intangible property, copyrights, patents. All of those things are considered assets, right? Information technology system would be your software that you use either for accounting or perhaps for telecommunications and security purposes. That's all information technology. And then the middle one, intellectual property, Native Learning Center, intellectual property is curriculum development, like what we're doing here. But I suppose you could have intellectual property when it comes to information technology, for example, and the development of specialized software. Again, those new monetary thresholds from 5,000 to 10,000 apply here too. So keep that in mind. Contractor, again, we're still in the definition, subpart A. Corrective action is found in subpart F, actually. It talks about what your management needs to do when there's an audit, when there's a finding during an audit. That has not changed. If there's a finding, there's a process that takes place. Corrective action is usually something that hopefully you don't have to do. That means that there was a finding and the organization or the tribe has to take corrective measures to resolve the problem after the audit is closed. It's something we really don't want to talk about, but it happens. Cost objective. The one I want to point out is at the bottom there, cost sharing. Write this one down. Refer to CFR 200-306. There's been a change there. It's a subtle change. It's more of a definition change than anything. And what they're proposing with cost sharing or matching is that they're planning to, or hopefully they're going to revise 200-306 cost sharing to clarify that matching is only one category of cost sharing overall. That's eliminating the need to repeat the term matching throughout. I know we go back and forth. We don't know what to use. Is it cost sharing or is it matching? Well, what they're trying to do here, it's not a monetary threshold. This is more semantics. They're trying to minimize the confusion here. Cost sharing seems to be the phrase that they're going with, and they're kind of eliminating the phrase matching. So moving forward, this might be a reality. Reason being is if you read this document, what they're trying to do is to a lot of things, but one of them is to, believe it or not, simplify the language of the contracts and of the notice of funding availability. Some of the documents, some of the information here of the proposed change, they're not regulations, but they're more initiatives that the federal agency has to streamline the process to make federal grant applications and notice of funding opportunities, NOFAs, and things like that more user friendly. Believe it or they are. They're immensely confusing. The NOFAs, I know you've probably experienced this, trying to read through notice of funding opportunities as well as grant agreements is can be very confusing because things seem to be no format for the way that they put that information down. So that's one of the reasons for this change here with cost sharing. They're trying to streamline the process so it's easier. The regulations are easier to follow. They're more user friendly. And same thing with the notice of funding opportunities and with the agreements. That I think is a great move. They're trying to streamline the process and make them not only more reader friendly, but more appropriate or open-ended for underserved communities. That's another one of their initiatives. It's not a regulation. You're not going to hear me talk about it in the regulation part, but it's an initiative that ONB hopes to put in place. I hope it happens with these proposed changes that they're going to make the notice of funding opportunities and grants in general more open-ended for underserved communities and more user-friendly so that more organizations are able to apply. It's complicated, that. These federal grant applications are immensely complicated. So hats off to them. I think they're trying in one regard to streamline the process. All right, no changes here in disallowed costs, expenditures, financial obligations, those terms and processes. Same thing with internal controls. No changes there. We've got to have internal controls. But let me give a quick look and see specifically if there's anything. I don't see. That would be 200, 301, 302, and 303. I don't see anything changing there. But down below where it says procurement methods, now you're getting into 200, 317, 318, 319, which is procurement standards and competition. The first one I can tell you that they're talking about changing is that first bullet, sealed bids. They are talking about, let me see if I can find the exact language here in the notes that I have. A couple things with bids or with sealed bids. One, allowing for, you may want to write these down seriously. A couple things here. One, propose to allow tribes to follow their own policies and procedures. That's the first one. Okay, that's going to apply to everything in procurement. Secondly, when it comes to competition and procurement methods, they're talking about allowing for a scoring mechanism. So when you have a sealed bid, you got to have some kind of a scoring mechanism to rank, the bidders that come in. a scoring mechanism that rewards bidders committing to specific numbers and types of jobs and certain compensations. Now, that's all I know about it right now. So it looks like they're opening that up for more interpretation. And this last one you're going to really like if you do a lot of sealed bids. Removes the requirement for tribes to open their sealed bids in public. Part of the sealed bid process is that you collect the information from the bidders, usually general contractors, and then you have to release that information in what they call the opening, where you literally open up their bids. And that's usually, it's mandated to do it in a public environment. Now they're proposing to remove that requirement. They're calling it remove the requirement for tribes to open sealed bids in public, which I think is that's great. All right, so there's something on procurement there. This doesn't change personally identifiable information or the protection of personally identifiable information. No changes there. You've got to identify personally identifiable information for your employees and for your customers. And you've got to have policies and internal controls in place that protects that information. That will not change at all in any way, shape, or form. If anything, it's going to tighten up as we get more and more focus on data. The agencies are coming down more and more on retrieving data. So I don't see these kind of regulations going away, and I don't see anything in the proposed requirements that would minimize any of this protected information. There was one on real property. I think it's not a dramatic change, but my understanding is they're trying to expand the definition of real property to, let's see if I can get my hands on it. I thought I had it in here, but I don't have the number handy. They're opening that up. Give me 1 second, I'll find it. I'm literally looking through. Here it is. Includes new section on independent appraisals. So they're expanding the definition of real property to include some other areas. Okay. Third party, no change there. So look, keep an eye on the chat box, but let's go into some specifics now. I'm going to move into section B, C, D, E, and F as quickly as possible, and kind of walk through the standard regulations and then point out anything that is unusual or subject to change or review. So you're aware. All right. In the section, subpart B of the uniform guidance is referred to general provisions. Most of it applies to the agencies and not so much to the recipients. I refer to this section simply as the 100s. And there are really nothing in here that's going to affect us in any way. The purpose remains the same. Applicability remains the same. We still got to use the federal regulations. The agencies, 106 here talks about the agency's obligation for implementation, not so much us. The implementation dates are long past. Uniform guidance has been in effect for 8-9 years now. So no surprises there, no changes there. So here's where some of the areas are changing, and that is what's called not so much mandatory disclosures. Mandatory disclosures means if you do something or if your organization does something criminal or illegal, not just make a mistake, but something illegal or criminal, you're supposed to declare that. That's what a mandatory disclosure is. Really no change there. They want to know if something's, you did something illegal, that type of thing. I know, kind of crazy, but that's the B. So not a whole lot of changes in B. Subpart A, definitions. Subpart B, general conditions. Let's see if subpart C, as I refer to it as the 200s under uniform guidance, it's the pre-federal award area. It's the 200s. And here I've got about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different potential changes. So let's see if we can identify anything that's on the list here. Okay, 200, 204, notice of funding opportunities. I kind of alluded to that before. what it's saying here, the normal process is competitive grants, cooperative agreements. That's the real bread and butter of federal funding. The federal awarding agency must announce specific funding opportunities by providing information in a public notice. As I alluded to a minute ago, they're trying to make some improvements there. What I have specifically to share with you on that 204, I got three things that supplement 204 proposed. One, encourages agencies, federal agencies, to focus more on communicating requirements to the public in a sensible and comprehensive manner. Wow. It's like they're learning table skills, they're learning how they're actually sharing something here. The second one underscores that agencies should consider all available data and evaluation results from. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. First one was correct. Second one, encourage plain language and notice of funding opportunities, as I mentioned before, and limit the length of the announcements. You ever see the notice of funding availabilities? They're like 70 pages long. And what's confusing is they repeat themselves 30 times throughout. And then you go through and you find things that are important, but it's buried in section 3, for example, but it applies to the whole grant opportunity. So I think they're really trying to put their notices in what they use. They're using the term plain language here. And then the last one, which I think is very generous on their part in 204, they're proposing to focus on underserved communities, as I mentioned before, to be consistent and transparent, attempting to ensure that applicants are not unintentionally excluded from funding opportunities. That's because the notices are so confusing, right? So that's a real good move in the right direction. All right, nothing else there. Then it jumps to 208, specific conditions, but there's something missing. In between 204 and 208 is 206, risk review. Now, in general, risk, fraud, personality, identity theft, and things like that are a real problem on a federal level, and it all trickles down for us. That's why we have personally identifiable information issues to deal with, right? So 206, it's not on your screen. You may want to write this one down. It's called Risk Review 200.206. It's been there, but it's ramping up. It's getting more and more tight as we progress through. One of the proposed changes is clarifying that federal agencies' processes may consider any risk criteria pertinent to a program. That would be like the Indian Housing Block Grant or the ICDBG, such as cybersecurity risk. It's kind of been out there, but now they're really recognizing cybersecurity as an issue. And my educated guess is we're going to see more and more regulations or notices coming out of the White House and out of HUD and ONAP, more and more on cybersecurity issues and the risk of loss that's associated with it. Here they don't explain what they're going to do, but we know it's under the microscope. So stand by. I can see as this program, as these updates are talked about and looked at throughout the country, what's going to come out of it is a specific regulation there that tightens up risk in general, and cybersecurity being probably at the top of that list. God, almost every other day, every week, don't we hear about a major company that's been hacked and information's been stolen, including our IDs and all kinds of different things? All right. Let's move on. Nothing on 208 there. 216. This one's been around. This is a Trump administration anti-China type thing. Prohibition on telecommunications. That is your audio-visual equipment. This is your low voltage cable installation. These are your surveillance cameras that you might have to observe and protect your facilities, your equipment, your employees, your members. There are restrictions on the procurement of this kind of equipment from basically Chinese companies. They're listed there literally in front of you. That has not gone away. In fact, what it says here in front, what I have in front of me is it says proposing several additions on the prohibition of certain telecommunications and video surveillance. So if anything, we're going to be looking at more regulations pertaining to the prohibition. I don't know what they are yet, but just circle this one as something that we need to be concerned about. And since we all have, to some degree, all of our operations probably have audio-visual equipment, we might even have a lot of surveillance, equipment and service contracts. It's something that we might have to take a look at from a compliance standpoint and tighten the screws a little bit as this gets fleshed out. Okay. So that's 216. What's not on your screen is the next one. It's brand new. It's not even in the current regulation subpart C or anywhere, but it's in the proposed, and that's 217. It's a brand new one, so new they don't even have a name for it. They're just saying, proposing to add a new section to CFR Part 200, 217, to expand on the whistleblower protections. Whistleblower. This is all tied to fraud, identity theft. It's all part risk reduction. So 217 is going to have something to do with us as recipients of federal funding, protecting information and putting in our internal controls and our policies and procedures some kind of verbiage, most likely, that protects what they phrase as whistleblower protection. People who see something, identify it, so they're not persecuted or prosecuted in any way, shape, or form. This all comes out of the problems back in the year 2000, 2001, 2002, when the Bernie Madoffs and the Enrons, if you remember, those investment people and investment companies crashed and burned, and a lot of people went to jail. There were a lot of penalties put in place. There was even legislation in the form of Sarbanes-Oxley, known as SOX, S-O-X, Sarbanes-Oxley legislation for the protection of financial information and or eliminating the destruction of financial records and the protection of whistleblowers. That was 20 years ago, and it's finally trickling down into regulations, brand new ones yet to be developed. Whistleblower protections, 217. Stand by, soon to come. Okay, that's section C. Now we've gone through A, B, and C. We are going to try to work our way into D, E, and F now, which is getting into, well, let's go right into it. D, as I call them, this is the 300s. All right. Now we're getting into things that are more in our realm of what we do as grant managers, program managers, compliance. Now we're getting into the post-federal award, which means grants management, more directed toward the recipient than the agency. All right, right off the bat, performance measurement 301, nothing specific in the proposed legislation, but you need to know that the regulation hasn't changed, but the emphasis, the initiative to have more and more data-driven performance measures, financial, informational, and performance measures built into everything we do. Everything. That's why those of us that receive the Indian Housing Block Grant are familiar with the beginning of the year report and end of the year report, known as the Indian Housing Plan, or IHP, the end of the year annual performance report, or APR. Those reports used to be Word documents, and then they went to Excel files, and now they're an online system. It used to be the EPIC system, EPIC, which is an acronym. Now it's moving to what's called the GEMS system, another online data-driven report. And we're seeing that more and more data-driven measurements, performance-based, And you're seeing more regulations. That's the initiative that OMB is putting on the agencies. The agencies are passing it on through the funding sources. So HUD, ONAP, and all the reports that go back and forth are moving in that direction. And you're going to see that performance measurements integrated in all of the regulations, especially in subpart D here, the post-federal award requirements for all federal funding recipients, not just IHBGs. Okay, financial management, nothing changes here specifically. We still got to have internal controls following generally accepted accounting principles for financial management as a whole. We still got to keep track of our federal funds. We need to segregate them following generally accepted GAAP principles, etc. Now, at the back end, we'll get to that in a minute. The back end where we get into auditing, that's subpart F. There have been some threshold changes there. There have been a couple small changes there, but this has not changed. We still are obligated to keep track on a regular basis of our financial activities. No specific changes there, and no specific changes to internal controls. We've still got to do it with reasonable assurance. We've got to have internal controls, and we've got to put them in place by the use of policies, written policies and procedures. That has not changed in any way, shape, or form. All right, so we still are no changes there. Still got to have internal controls. Here's just these two or three slides here are just examples of some of the policies, titles of policies and procedures that fall within our internal controls, such as code of conduct, conflict of interest, confidentiality, no nepotism in the organization, financial management, procurement. We need written policies for all of those that are up to date, and there's more there. Those are kind of on the up. I don't know if I mentioned this before. Internal controls come in three areas. There's kind of like three pillars that hold up the internal controls. I've talked about two of them already. One is financial activities, of course. The second one is operational activities. And the third one is compliance. Those are the three pillars, so to speak. If you can envision, internal controls sitting on top of a platform, and the three pillars holding it up are operation, finance, and compliance. Your internal controls are those three pillars, and your policies and procedures are the bricks and mortar that make up those pillars. And these are just examples on the operation side. Plus, you probably have more policies and procedures based on the type of program that you operate. If you're an Indian Housing Block Grant recipient, you're going to have a slew of policies and procedures in your internal controls that are housing related, and this is just a few of them. Rent and home buyer payment, eligibility for admissions and occupancy, management and maintenance, tenant and homeowner selection, and so on. Things that pertain to renting and homeowners and the repair and building of homes, low income Native American housing, which is what the Indian Housing Block Grant is all about. Okay, keep going here. A little bit more on housing, just some more policies, potential policies. All right, now back into the regulations, 305 and 306. Not much of a change in 305 to speak of. Federal payment, they still want their money. They're still going to give you money. They're still going to, in some cases, want you to repay money back. Unfortunately, when it happens from an audit finding or something, that hasn't changed. What has changed down below in 306, I mentioned it before, consolidation of terms, semantics, basically. I think what they're saying with the proposed change is they're eliminating the phrase or the word matching. I don't like that. They're calling it one category of cost sharing. So cost sharing seems to be the phrase that they're comfortable with. You're going to see that more and more in the language that's being put out, and you're going to see the phrase matching, whether it's, every grant that we apply for has some kind of a cost share, aka matching requirement. They usually do 5, 10, 15%, 20%, whatever. Over time, you're going to see that phrase matching go away, and cost sharing will be the catchphrase that they were. So just a heads up, it's more semantics more than anything. Okay, so that's 306. This one is 307, program income. Of course, we all like to generate program income where we can. It's allowable. There is two potential changes here, or I don't know if it's a change. One is clarifying the use and expenditure of program income, including allowing program income from certain closeout costs. All right, that's kind of vague. So we'll have to see what comes of that with program income. And then also proposing some clarification on what they're calling the 3 methods of use of program income. So more on that later. Oh, by the way, I'm going to be doing a session on this in when is it? I want to say it's in November. If you could put up the dates for the update, it's a 2-part webinar or virtual training on updates to the uniform guidance. And I'm hoping it's either in November and December, and we're going to put it up here in the chat box so to give you exact dates. Please join me, because by November at the earliest, December at the latest, I should have more clarification on the specifics to these updates. Right now, about 50% of this stuff is kind of open-ended. We're not getting a lot of definitive changes. It's just that there will be changes to program income. There's going to be more verbiage, and we're going to be tightening the screws, but they're not telling us exactly what it is. November 14th and 15th. Everyone, if you're interested at all in getting more details, specifics on not only the uniform guidance, but just on these proposed updates that have numerous changes to the existing updates, join me November 14th and 15th for that. We should have more definition on these updates, okay? So I just want to put that out there. That's very, very important. Okay, change it to 308. Yeah, what it says here on revision of budget and program plans, they propose to clarify items requiring prior approval. This is a positive. Clarifying items requiring prior approval, including requesting additional funds, transferring funds, and no-cost extensions. Okay, good. One of the initiatives they have, another initiative, it's not a regulation, it's not attached to any of the uniform guidance numbers, is an initiative to reduce the number of what's called prior approvals. They used to be called prior written approvals. You had to put it in writing. Now they're dropping the word written, and they're eliminating a lot of the requirements. And apparently one of them falls into this category. Revision of budget and program plans, clarifies items requiring prior approval. So I'm hoping what that means is they're loosening up the requirements here in this section. You have a revision to your budget that's over a certain percentage, as it says there in red, then you are currently, it hasn't changed yet, currently obligated to do what's called prior written approval. Get approval from your funding source that you're making the change. So hopefully they are loosening that. All right, so that's really good stuff. All right, nothing here. These next two, equipment and supplies, as I alluded to before, these two areas contain probably the most changes of all of the document, all of the regulations. So let me go through what we have here and what they're proposing, so we can have an educated idea of what they're talking about, the significant change they're making. Right now in the regulations is what you see on the screen. It's pretty straightforward. Equipment states that equipment must be used by the non-federal entity, or NFE, in the program or project for which it was acquired, and as long as needed, whether or not the project program continues in support By the federal award, the NFE must not encumber the property without prior approval. There's that phrase again, prior approval of the awarding agency, no longer needed for eligible programs. Okay, now what they're proposing, this is a couple areas you might want to write down when it comes to equipment. One, we already talked about, they're increasing the threshold of what's classified as equipment, you know, the monetary equivalency from 5,000 to 10,000. That's what they're proposing. That one seems to make logical to me that that would be carried through and be approved. The next one they're proposing, you're going to love that we're getting into some good stuff here. The second one is they're proposing to allow tribes to dispose of equipment in according to tribal law, not necessarily by the regulations. So in this case, what they're allowing is tribal law here to supersede the old regulations on, and in this case, the disposition, the disposal of old equipment, or maybe even new, you know, used equipment that you want to sell or whatever. Tribal law. That's good. Third one clarifies that recipients, that's us, may retain equipment with no further obligation to the agency when not prohibited by statute or regulations. That means we don't, a prior approval issue again. Don't need agency, proposing that we don't need agencies to keep equipment beyond their usable life. Fourth one, enhances the reinforcement of recipients' responsibility to maintain updated records on equipment. So what they're doing, they're finding a balance here. They're kind of giving you, opening up the door a little bit when it comes to equipment, raising the threshold, giving you more options. But at the same time, they're saying you're going to have to improve your tracking, your internal tracking system and record keeping system. So that you maintain, it's an area that a lot of organizations end up as a finding. They don't do a really good job tracking equipment. So they're raising the threshold. So that's going to take a lot of equipment off the chart, so to speak, off the radar screen. But they're looking for, the feds are looking for you to have more processes in place for keeping track of your equipment. So it's a good, it's 3 steps forward, and then one, you've got to do this to get the 3 steps. All right, that's equipment, section 200-313. And 314, let's just look at supplies. There's not much there. It's just saying the existing regulation says supplies state that the title to supplies worth 5,000 or less will vest with the non-federal entity. Basically, if it's less, one of the benchmarks for a supply is it's less than 5,000. Now they're talking about, as I mentioned before, increasing that to 10,000, just like equipment. And they've got another one here, and I don't quite know what this means, but we'll see. You may want to write this one down. The second one in supplies, other than the increased threshold, includes what's coming is a definition of unused supplies. That's new. Unused, quote unquote, unused supplies. And I don't see that. That's really not spelled out in any of the existing regulations, unused supplies. So let's wait and see what that is. We want to mark that down as an unknown coming up. Okay, intangible property, we talked about that before, no change there. We talked about the general procurement and the maintaining oversight, written procedures. We talked specifically about the sealed bid, that it does not have to be tried. What they're talking about is try not having to be required to open up the sealed bids in a public environment. They don't have, that's one of the things they're talking about eliminating. Okay. Another one in just, is it here? Let me go back a slide. No, I don't. You may want to make a note here. 317, it's not on the screen, but 317 is procurement by state. You know, tribes are looked upon as being the equivalent of a state. Their sovereignty gives them the equivalent, as the federal government is concerned, gives them the equivalency of being a state. And what they're saying on 200.317, procurement by states, is what they're proposing, it allows tribes to follow their own policies and procedures, period. Well, that, from a compliance standpoint, that's a really big statement, even though there's only 7 words in it. Allows tribes to follow their own policies and procedures when it comes to procurement. Well, wow, that could be interpreted, off the top of the head here. I'm thinking that could be interpreted meaning that as a recipient of federal funding and working for the tribe, we create our own procurement standards and we do not have to follow 318, which you see on your screen, General Procurement Standards of the federal government. Is that what it means? Wow, that would really be something if they were to change all these protocols and do away with it for tribes. Now we're just talking tribes here, or perhaps even nonprofits that serve tribes that receive federal funding. That's going to be one I'm going to be watching very, very carefully. 200-317, procurement by states, allowing tribes to follow their own policies and procedures for procurement. That might eliminate all of the protocols that the feds have put in place for us to follow for sealed bids, for competitive procurement, and for what's called sole source, the third option that we have. Okay, just put that one to the side, because right now we still have the protocols, we still have the regulations you see in front of you. They haven't gone away yet, but we'll see. That's going to be a very, very, very interesting. Okay. No other changes to 318 because I just dropped a bomb with 317, right? 319, competition, opens a couple things here. Well, really one thing that I think might have some application to us. I might have said this before. Competition, it says on the screen, all procurement transactions must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition. Yeah, that makes sense. What they're proposing is allows for a scoring mechanism to be developed by the recipient, that's us, that rewards bidders, like a sealed bid process. Rewards, those are your general contractors bidding on one of your projects. Rewards bidders committing to specific numbers and types of jobs, certain compensation and benefits to their subcontractors or to their employees. So that might be something you could incorporate in your scoring during your bid process, a new category that if the bidder, if the general contractor, and this is my interpretation of it, if the general contractor agrees to a specific number, for example, of Native Americans or tribal member employment, they would get extra points that you could assign to them. That sounds like they could be part of this. So in 319, where it says competition, make a note that scoring might be enhanced, giving you the opportunity to score your bids in the sealed bid process with more flexibility than you had before, to create categories that are federally approved, not just tribally approved. Okay? So if you're already giving points for them hiring Native Americans or tribal members, that's great. Now it sounds like the trickle down here is going to be federal approval to do that, and I hope that pans out. All right, 318, we talked about 318, 319. Let's keep going here. 320 gets into the actual methods, more details on the sealed bid, which I talked about. That's all I've been talking about for the past 15 minutes. The sealed bid, and the next couple slides talk about that. And proposals, RFPs, RFQs, requests for proposals, that's all part of the sealed bid process. You got the gist of what I was talking about there. 320 also talks about the 2 other types of procurement. Competitive, which probably makes up about, in most cases, 80 to 85% of your procurement is competitive. Where you go out and you get bids and that type of thing, check prices, that kind of thing, not sealed bids, but competitive. That's probably, like most organizations, the bulk of your procurement. No real changes there that I can tell. That's 320. I don't see anything in the proposed regulations other than the ones I've talked about, the big one being in the sealed bid area, removing the requirement for tribes to open sealed bids in public, in a public environment. So no changes here. Competitive procurement and sole source procurement, no changes. That's this slide here, also known as non-competitive procurement, aka sole source, when there's a special need to buy something and an act of nature comes through, a hurricane in our neck of the woods, hurricane flooding tears the roof off, or a tornado or an earthquake destroys the building. You got to make an emergency purchases to protect the building, et cetera, et cetera. That's sole source. Things like that. That's the number 3 type of procurement. No real changes there that they're proposing. All right, so it all kind of floated around sealed bids. Nothing here. Domestic preference, that hasn't changed. The Biden administration, just like the Trump administration and every administration before that, wants, to the best of your ability, to buy domestic, buy American if you can. And that's what this is saying here. It's not so much a regulation as it is that you can see it right in its definition. It's a preference. Okay. The only, let's see if I can find it. The only one with this domestic preferences, there's a couple things you got to be aware of. There are some limitations on, when we talked about the telecommunications and the Chinese companies, there's also some limitations on the purchase of certain construction materials. Same thing, buying domestic specifically in the areas of home construction, commercial construction, not so much heavy highway, but those two, commercial and home building, wood in particular for building supplies, PVC pipe, concrete. Concrete is an aggregate, so the aggregate components of concrete. I mentioned PVC, lumber. There might be a couple others, but those are the big 3. Buying domestic for those kind of products has always been there. And that's what 322 is talking about. That's not going to change, and there's no proposed changes to it either. We either good or bad. So we'll just leave that one as is. They're not going to get that. This one, monitoring, tightening the screws on and it makes perfect sense. Everything's more data driven, and fraud and all those things we were talking about with personally identifiable information. It would make sense that there's more stipulations when it comes to monitoring your program, known as self-monitoring. It's a requirement. It's kind of like an internal audit. Self-monitoring is required. Program reports are required. And that's what it's talking about in 329. And what they're saying here, as far as updates, is potential new language in this area that would add, not change, but add some new language that emphasizes the importance of measuring the customer's experience. Hey, now we're moving into the area that a lot of other industries have to experience. The healthcare industry, the automotive industry, a lot of industries are very much concerned about the consumer experience. We're no different. So that's what we're seeing here. And this makes sense coming from the Biden labor-focused administration, that there would be new regulations, new languages perhaps being developed that'll be translated into requirements that emphasize the importance of more data-driven activities. We know that, but measuring customer experience. We've never heard that phrase before, right? Measuring customer experience, even though we probably all have good customer service within our organizations, to our clients, to our constituents, to ourselves, to our colleagues, to our tribal council, etc. Now it's being proposed to be incorporated in the regulations. So here's a discussion we need to have with ourselves and with our organization, with our IT, how do we start measuring performance satisfaction of the recipients and integrate it into our program, into our reports? Open-ended right now. Stand by for more tightening of that one. Okay. All right. That probably ends that section. No, nothing there. All right. In the remaining half hour that we have, I want to go through subpart E and subpart F. Subpart E are the cost principles. In other words, what's allowable as a cost item, allowable, allocable, reasonable. So there's a whole section on that. That's called cost principles. That's section E. And then F is the last one, that's on audits. So let's go into the cost principles. That is section 400. We're in the 400s now, okay? So no change here in the policy guide. It's still there. Nothing with 403. 404 talks about, before we get into 404, there's 403, allowability. Okay, no radical changes here. These are factors affecting allowability of costs, whether they need to be necessary, they need to be reasonable, they need to be allowable. That hasn't changed. That all makes sense. There's no change there. Policies and procedures need to be in place that explain what your procurement standards are, and that you only make procurement of items that are necessary, reasonable, cost-effective, etc. You follow generally accepted accounting practices. So no change there. That makes perfect sense. No changes in that. Reasonable cost 404. No, more definition on what reasonable cost is. And it's just what it says. Reasonable cost is something that's fair. And, as it says in the first bullet, reasonableness is determined by whether the cost is generally recognized as ordinary and necessary. So no radical changes there. We're not changing the philosophy of what reasonable is. So no change there. Still got to abide by that. We talked about allowable costs. That's all part of it. This is where they're making a lot of changes to our benefit. They are talking about 407 specifically says proposing to remove 10 items from the prior written approval requirements list. And there's just a couple of them listed there. There's only like 3 or 4 that you see on the screen, but there are numerous. There are several of them. And they're talking about eliminating, and we've talked about a couple of them already. Equipment is one they propose to remove, so you wouldn't need prior approval for equipment. Real property, direct costs, entertainment costs, exchange rates, memberships in professional organizations, the cost of that, and a couple other things that are kind of unrelated. But eliminating a lot of those type of cost items, removing the requirement for a prior approval. Yeah, and then the second bullet underneath there, considering removes reference to requiring prior approval for the use of grants and cooperative agreements as a whole. Wow, that's a big one. That's another catch-all, right? 9 words that capture the whole thing. Proposing to remove reference to require prior, I see. The phrase prior written approval. Remember, that's the phrase they use right now. They want to take out the word written and consolidate it into prior approval. Okay, I had to read that a couple of times for the use of grants and cooperative agreements. So it's a semantics thing again. Removes references to the phrase, not to the requirement, to the phrase prior written approval. And at the same time, take some of those prior approval conditions out, 10 of them. So improvements. All right, that's 207. 13 gets into direct cost. No change there. Direct cost is a direct cost. Must be included in the budget. 14 to 14. Now you're getting into indirect costs. That's a little more open-ended. They've got a couple here, but the one that they have that would apply to us, I think, is referring to organizations that are getting federal funding for the first time. Propose to raise what's called the de minimis rate of indirect costs from 10% to 15% to allow for a more realistic recovery of indirect costs, particularly for new or inexperienced organizations that may not have the capacity but deserve to be fully compensated for their overhead costs. First of all, can you imagine that kind of language coming out of the Trump administration? No. Secondly, this is great. It's a 50% increase of what when you first get into funding and you don't have a indirect cost rate already established or mandated by the funding source. The Fed said you can go no lower or no higher than 10% for an indirect cost rate. Here they're saying that they were proposing bringing that up to 15%. So for startups or first-time recipients, that's a bonus for them. And just the verbiage in there, particularly new inexperienced organizations. Wow, that's just so gracious. Those words are just so open-ended. Okay, that's 13. 14 is just more on indirect costs. The difference, and this is something, if you got a smartphone or anything, take a picture of that little graphic. That was done by a friend of mine, Lucy Morgan, who does a lot of, she is from My Federal Trainer. She's a great trainer when it comes to federal funding. And this is her chart. This is all about indirect costs, but the difference about true indirect costs compared to administrative costs, which can be indirect costs, but she breaks it down. There's a nice little matrix on the right. I would suggest taking a picture of it and using that. It helped clear my mind when trying to figure out, what is an indirect cost versus an administrative cost. So it's a very nice, I think, helpful, but no other changes there other than what I told you about the de minimis rate changing. Okay. Let's see. This gets into, 420s. From 421, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, through 475, are, 54 different items of cost, select items of cost, such as, and whether they're allowable or unallowable. So you have things in there like alcohol, for example. That was pretty straightforward. You're not supposed to use federal funds for the purchase of alcohol in any way, shape, or form. Another one that you cannot spend money on, and it's flat, and don't expect any change, is lobbying or the influence of legislation, lobbying efforts. You cannot use federal funds to influence legislation. You cannot use federal funds to contribute to a PAC, political action committee. You cannot use federal funds to influence any type of political activity on a tribal level, state, regional, or national level. You can't use federal funds. So that's another pretty obvious one. But there are 50 of them listed in the 400s in the cost principle section. You can go through them. And the only thing I have on that whole section is a proposal that says clarification in the verbiage that selective items of cost, this whole section here, is not a comprehensive list. And failure to list an item does not make it allowable or unallowable. Well, that's a very open-ended statement. I hope what it comes out to mean is they're going to expand this list and give us more ideas what's allowable. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about this. For the next several slides, I'm not going to go through all of it because you can do that at your leisure and go through every single one of the items of the 54 items that they've identified as either allowable or unallowable or a combination of the two. Depending on the circumstances, it might be allowable. So advertising, alcoholic beverages, audit services, you can have an audit done. It's an allowable cost if you qualify, if you meet the threshold. More on that later. Bad debts, and then more here on bonding, collection of improper payments, compensation for personnel services, and the next slide is going to be fringe benefits. Conferences, see if I have anything on that. Okay, one thing that it says about this one, conferences, 432, excuse me, I'm trying not to sneeze. Oh my gosh. It says removes limitations provided by the select types of listed events. Okay, what do they mean by that? Look at the top where it says conferences allowable. It says a conference is defined as a meeting, a retreat, a seminar, a symposium, a workshop, or event with a primary purpose of disseminating technical information beyond the company, beyond the non-federal entity. Two things. One, dissemination of technical information is a phrase you need to be aware of. And secondly, what this new proposal is saying is there probably are other terms that we use. We had one the other day. Oh, assembly. Assembly. Federal employees meet in an assembly. Legislators meet in an assembly, right? So that is a phrase that means a meeting or a conference, but it's not listed there. What they're saying here on this proposed is that there are probably other terms that we missed that could be included, like assembly, that could be included in this definition to be allowable. So that's all it's saying with conferences. They've just expanded the definition of it. Okay, nothing radical here. Let's see, 432, 438, 440 is where I want to go. I think I just passed it. Bottom of the screen here, exchange rates. Probably doesn't apply to most of us, most of you, but there are a few tribes that, like the Akwesasne, St. Regis Mohawk in upstate New York, overlap into Canada. Half the reservations in upstate New York, half of it's across the border, the national border into Canada. That's one of the tribes that has issues with exchange rates with the Canadian dollar compared to the American dollar. They've opened that up. They've made removes what they're proposing is removes the prior approval. They've already approved it. If you read that exchange rates at the bottom, it's allowable. But now they're going to take that away from the prior approval. That's one of the 10 exchange rates. Not a big deal for most of us, but for some tribes, also in Michigan and Montana, that have, and Washington, no, not so much Washington. I'm not aware of any there, but maybe that overlap into the Canadian provinces. That's an issue for them, exchange rates. Or maybe south and, tribes down in Arizona or New Mexico, overlapping into Mexico and the exchange rate there. So some extremes, but wide open. That's good. It's wonderful. 54, 55, 56, nothing else with the remaining costs. Nothing's changed here. So what you see here and what you see in the regulations, no changes. Other than what we might, there's lobbying again. See lobby in the middle of that screen, allowable in every way, shape, or form. In fact, if you've ever filed for federal funding, you know that there's a form that you have to fill out that says, in addition to what we're doing here with the regulations, they actually have you fill out a form that says you're not doing any lobbying. So this is very, very important. So no changes there. Okay. And any of these others, all the way through to the end. We've kind of talked about the ones, and these are pretty straightforward, taxes and all that kind of stuff. There's telecommunications, 200, 471 that I talked about specifically. Allowable, generally speaking, for you can buy audiovisual equipment. That's the allowable part because it's a necessary cost of doing business, right? Generally speaking, but there's a moratorium on certain kinds. It says certain kinds. So you got to go to 471 and look at the specifics, right? And at the bottom, travel costs. No changes there. Travel's allowed. You can pay the cost of travel to go anywhere that's related to the mission, related to what you do on as your work, as long as it falls into your procurement standards of a reasonable, allowable cost, then you have no problem with it. All right. Now, a couple other things in the 10 or 11, 12 minutes we have. The last section here, the 500s audit requirements. Okay, let's touch on this. There's only really one major one that I got a couple here, but only one major significant one. And it's 501. I don't have it on the screen here, but I'll read it to you. And that's audit requirements. All right. Not basic, not 502, but 501. And in that section, if you look it up, it says audit required. A single audit in particular is required if you receive $750,000 or more in the program year. So you receive $750,000 or more in program funds, then you can you're required to have a single audit. They are proposing to raise that to 1 million. All right, so that's the big change. It's another threshold change, 750,000 to $1 million in federal fund program per year that would trigger the single audit. All right, so put that in your notes, put that aside. That's a possibility. 510. Let's see if I have it on here. Nothing, no other changes here. You got to have an audit done. We know that. There are sanctions that come with it. There are repercussions that come from, from findings. That's what all this is talking about. But I want to see if I have 510. Yeah. One of the other changes is in here, financial statements. You've got to provide the auditors, well, just for the operation, of course, you've got to have financial statements, right? You can find that in 2 CFR Part 200.302. You can find the requirements, general speaking, for financial statements. But here in the audit requirements 510, it talks more about financial statements. And one of the things you're proposing clarifies the guidance of audits covering multiple recipients, such as departments and organizational units. All right, that's pretty open-ended. I think what they're saying there is there's just going to be more specifications on financial statements when it comes to audit. So we'll have to watch for this one. Mark this one down. There could be a tightening of the screws in the financial statements that are needed for audits. And the next one they talk about for proposed change is not so much the follow-up. We know there's a finding, there's going to be a follow-up. There has to be a report, responsibilities. But this one, scope of the audit, says here, proposing revisions of compliance requirements to include a test. A test is what the auditors refer to when they do processes to make sure everything's working correctly. It's called a test. Test of transactions and other auditing procedures necessary to provide the auditor with sufficient evidence to support an opinion on compliance. Another open-ended statement, another nebulous statement. I think where we're going here is there's going to, just like the financial statements, there's going to be more specification in 200.514 here on the scope of the audit and the detail of the audit. So stand by for that. Mark that one down. Scope of the audit may change. I don't know, positive or negative. I don't know yet, but mark that one down. And the last one, 516, audit findings. Hopefully something you don't have to deal with. Revises the definition of known questioned cost. 3 words there, that phrase. Revises the definition of known question cost and likely question cost, and provides further clarity on how they are identified in the audit report. So more details. Again, I think that would be incorporated in the scope of the audit. Okay. Just more detail with the audits. So here we've kind of gone through in the last few minutes. Let me say what this is when it comes to these proposed regulations to the uniform guidance 2 CFR 200, it appears that we're taking like 3 steps forward in positive movement to 1 step backward. And the backward is not so much backwards, but tightening of regulations, right? On our end. And it mentioned that a few times, like with equipment, we're going to have more requirements probably coming down on tracking, record keeping of equipment. So that's probably going to parlay into other areas, like personally identifiable information and just, your record keeping in general. Look for more requirements there as this rolls out. All right, so that is all I have on the actual regulations, but it's not in the presentation, but there is one other area. There is also an appendix to the 2 CFR Part 200, Appendix 1. And I just want to read the highlights. It's not changing regulation. What it says, I'll just read it verbatim, because it's not so much a regulation that we have to do. It's just more of a thought process that's coming from ONB on this whole process. It says, revises the appendix to improve this. Listen, you're going to love this. To improve the quality and accessibility of funding opportunities as a whole, including plain language principles, thank God. That's A. B, grouping similar items together to streamline content. 3, align sections more closely in the application process. 4, include basic information at the beginning and top of the funding opportunity so applicants can more easily make decisions on whether to apply. And lastly, 5, more clearly define which items must be included in the section of the funding opportunity versus what is discretionary. Oh my God. If that's what they're really trying to do, that would be a godsend. Because as I mentioned before, it's a task going through these notices of funding opportunity. I'm doing it right now, looking at the SEEDS grant from ANA, looking at the SEEDS grant. They haven't rolled out the NOFO for 2024, but I got the 2023, and it's like 17 people put it together. You know, it's a little bit here, and then you read a little farther, and then they talk about something else, and it also pertains to the first section, but you don't know it until you get to the next section. I'm so glad that I'm seeing this, and I really, really do hope that some of that does pan out. And then when we get together in November 14th and 15th, for a more detailed update, again, with that, what we're talking about here, dedicated to the Federal Register, or to the uniform guidance, that a lot of these things have been fleshed out, and we can have more definitive answers. One more thing before I end. They also include, now what I've been talking about are the proposed. These are the real proposed. And, you know, we're going to know a lot more about this by November, December at the latest. They also have what they call highlights of other revisions and future updates to 2 CFR Part 200 under consideration. So I want to mention these real quick, because these are like strategic plan, but pushed out about 3 years probably. Maybe even 4 years, but it's on their radar screen and they're admitting to it, which I love. We've got transparency here. Number 1 of under consideration for the next go around of major revisions. Number 1, more establishing specific audit requirements for-profit entities, not nonprofit, for-profit entities, which currently are not subject to the requirements of Subpart F. So our for-profit brothers and sisters might be brought into the equation. Then we got a couple things at the agency level. Then next one is establishing mechanisms to automatically adjust certain thresholds, like we've been talking about. You know, we just talked about the audit threshold, right? 750,000 to $1 million. Then we talked about supplies and equipment, 5,000 to 10,000. What it's saying here is establishing mechanisms to automatically adjust thresholds due to inflation and other triggering events. I really hope that pans out. I really hope that is a real long-range goal under consideration, that these thresholds would ramp up in the same way that other costs will, and that these thresholds would actually rise as we go along. That would be wonderful. All right, so that one. Also, the next one, the third one, is remove even more prior approval requirements. Wow, that'd be great. Streamline the process. Put more ownership in the hands of the tribes and the recipients, and take away the federal control over it, more and more self-realization here. And then the last one, expanding the guidance in subpart F, which is the audit section, which we just finished, to include more specific requirements on the scope of the audit. Here it is, on the scope of the audit, quote unquote, proper perspective, so that agencies have additional contextual information to guide them in resolving audit findings. I really hope that pans out more information for the audit team to have the ability to learn how programs work before they start the audit. We ran into that problem years ago when we had an audit team come in from a big auditing firm that didn't know anything about the Indian Housing Block Grant or how the program worked. We had to spend a fair amount of time educating them on how the program worked before they started the audit. But it wasn't incorporated as a usable function of the audit. Now it sounds like they're trying to build in it sounds positive to me that they're trying to build in features in the audit that allow them to have more flexibility to understand. Okay, I meant to put that in. All right, that's what I have. We're done. I hope this makes sense. This is so unique. This today takes, hardly, they only change every 5 years. So now we have a chance to look at what's in place and what could be in place very shortly. 60-day window for comments. We could see a final rule coming out changing these federal guidelines as soon as December of this coming year, November, December, maybe January at the ultimate latest, which is within, fiscal year 24 starts in a couple days. At least I think it does, if the government doesn't shut down. But yeah, and so this would all be effective within fiscal year 24, right? That's the year coming up, right? Is it 24, 25? 24, right? Starts October 1 through September 30th of next year. So the regulation and the interpretation of them would go into effect. So that's what we need to do. We need to wait for them to come out. We need the final rule to come out, and then for interpretation, and then okay, back to, I'm so sorry. Thank you for sticking with me with this. Good information, critical information. Louise, I'm going to kick it back over to you
Great job, Vince. As always, you did an incredible job. I went ahead and put your email in the chat box, and I put my email as well. If anyone would like the PDF version of today's presentation, please feel free to email me, and I would be more than happy to give you a copy. I'm going to go ahead and launch today's survey. Please take, it takes just a couple of seconds to fill it out. It is also anonymous. So please let us know how you felt about today's webinar. The information greatly helps Vince and the Native Learning Center as well. It just tells us what you liked, what you didn't like, what you would like to know more about, and let us know if there's any topics you would like to hear from Vince in the future. We would be more than happy to put those on the books. And I have also included the link for the Board of Commissioners training in November 14th and 15th that Vince was talking about. So if you'd like to register, please don't forget to click the link. Our next webinar is going to be October 5th. It is going to be recruitment and interviewing for tribal housing, presented by Lisa Perez, founder and CEO of HBL Resources, Inc., and the Complete Manager Makeover. She is founder of National Management Training Week, Human Resources Consultant. It will be at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Alaska, and registration is free as always. Go ahead and access our recordings at any time. They are on our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. We do have Vince's last 3 recordings on there as well. So if you need help finding the complete Tribal Grants Management Parts 1 through 4, please go ahead and email me as well, and I'd be more than happy to send you the links for those recordings. Go ahead and check out our upcoming events as well on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We also have a podcast called Hope a Thing, a Native American Podcast, and you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Simplecast. We are on Pandora, iHeartRadio, and so many more. So go ahead and search us up. I hope everybody has a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us today. And like I said, if you have any questions and concerns, or if you would like to have a copy of the presentation, please go ahead and email me at alystaatkins@simtribe.com. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.